What happens when one of Hollywood's most intense actors sits down with late-night television's sharpest wit, and things go completely sideways? Tonight, we're diving into the moment that had everyone talking when Mark Wahlberg and Stephen Colbert's interview spiraled into chaos so quickly that cameras kept rolling as the Transformers star walked right off the set. This wasn't your typical celebrity promotion gone wrong. This was a full-blown confrontation that neither host nor guest saw coming. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below about the most awkward interview you've ever seen, because what you're about to witness might just top your list. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert had been running smoothly that evening. Colbert, known for his razor-sharp commentary and ability to make even the most reserved celebrities open up, was preparing for what seemed like a routine interview. Mark Wahlberg was scheduled to promote his latest action thriller, and the producers expected the usual back and forth about stunts, Boston, and maybe some light-hearted ribbing about his early music career. What they got instead was television, gold that no one could have scripted. Wahlberg walked onto the stage with his typical confident swagger, waving to the audience before settling into the guest chair. The crowd's enthusiasm was palpable, and Colbert opened with his trademark grin. "Mark Wahlberg, everybody," Colbert announced as the applause died down. "Thanks for being here, Mark. I have to say, watching your latest movie, I kept thinking about how you've really mastered the art of looking intense while things explode around you." Wahlberg chuckled, adjusting his position in the chair. "Well, Stephen, when you've been doing this as long as I have, you learn that sometimes the best acting happens when you're not really acting at all." "Interesting philosophy," Colbert replied. Leaning forward slightly, "Speaking of not really acting, I've been curious about something. You've built this incredible career playing these tough guy roles, but I wonder, do you ever worry about the message that sends, especially to younger audiences?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something in Colbert's tone suggested he was probing deeper than the usual promotional interview would allow. Wahlberg's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around his eyes that viewers who knew his work would recognize. "What kind of message do you think I'm sending?" Stephen Wahlberg asked, his Boston accent becoming more pronounced as it always did when he was getting defensive. "Well," Colbert continued, clearly comfortable with the direction this was heading, "you've made a career out of playing characters who solve problems with violence, who use intimidation and aggression to get what they want. Don't you think that glorifies a certain kind of masculinity that maybe we should be moving away from?" The studio audience fell quiet, sensing that this wasn't going to be the light-hearted celebrity chat they'd expected. Wahlberg's jaw clenched slightly, and he leaned back in his chair, studying Colbert with new intensity. "You know what, Stephen?" Wahlberg said, his voice taking on an edge. "I think you're confusing entertainment with real life. When I was growing up in Dorchester, the guys who were really tough, the guys who actually had to deal with real problems, they weren't the ones making movies about it. They were living it." Colbert's eyebrows raised slightly, recognizing that he'd struck a nerve. "But that's exactly my point, Mark. You did live it, and then you turned that experience into a very profitable brand. Doesn't that feel a little bit like exploitation of the very community you came from?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Wahlberg's hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests, now gripped them slightly tighter. His breathing became more measured the way it did in his movies, right before his character was about to explode. "Exploitation," Wahlberg repeated, his voice dropping to a lower register. "Stephen, with all due respect, and I mean that, you grew up comfortable. You went to good schools, you had opportunities handed to you. So maybe you don't understand what it means to actually fight your way out of a situation where the odds are stacked against you." Colbert's smile never wavered, but there was steel behind it now. "You're absolutely right, Mark. I did have advantages, but that's exactly why I can look at this objectively. When someone with your background makes millions of dollars playing characters who use violence to solve problems, and then markets that to kids who might be living the reality you escaped from, don't you see the contradiction?" The contradiction. Wahlberg's voice was rising now, though he was clearly trying to maintain some semblance of composure. "The contradiction is sitting here listening to someone who's never had to throw a real punch in his life, lecture me about violence." The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable. Audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and the camera operators were getting shots they never expected to need. Colbert, however, seemed to be relishing this moment. "You know what Mark Colbert said?" His voice calm but razor-sharp. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe the fact that you did have to throw punches, that you did have to fight. Maybe that's exactly why you shouldn't be the one deciding what messages we send about how to handle conflict." Wahlberg's face flushed red, and for a moment it looked like he might actually leap out of his chair. Instead, he pointed a finger directly at Colbert, his voice now barely controlled. "Don't you dare sit there in your fancy suit, in your comfortable little bubble, and tell me what I should or shouldn't do with my life experiences. You have no idea what it's like to come from where I came from. But I'm not talking about your life," Mark Colbert shot back, his own composure starting to crack slightly. "I'm talking about the movies you choose to make, the image you choose to sell. There's a difference between surviving your circumstances and profiting off of them." Profiting. Wahlberg's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You think this is about profit? Stephen, every movie I make, every role I take, I'm thinking about kids who are where I was. Kids who need to see that you can make it out, that you can turn your life around, by showing them that the way to solve problems is to hit first and ask questions later," Colbert countered. "Because that's what your characters do, Mark. Over and over again." Wahlberg stood up abruptly, his chair rolling back slightly from the force. The audience gasped audibly, unsure if this was part of some elaborate bit or if they were witnessing a genuine meltdown. Colbert remained seated, but his posture straightened, clearly preparing for whatever was coming next. "You want to know what my characters do?" Wahlberg demanded, his voice now carrying across the entire studio without the need for amplification. "They protect people. They stand up for what's right. They don't sit behind desks making jokes about things they don't understand." "Oh, so now I don't understand comedy?" Colbert asked, rising to meet Wahlberg's energy. "Because last I checked, that's actually my job, just like making violent movies seems to be yours." "There's nothing funny about what we're talking about right now," Stephen Wahlberg said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow felt more threatening than his shouting. "Nothing funny about growing up afraid to walk home from school. Nothing funny about watching your friends get arrested, get killed, get hooked on drugs. And there's definitely nothing funny about some privileged comedian using that pain as material for his monologue." The accusation hit Colbert like a physical blow. His face went pale, and for the first time since the interview began, he seemed genuinely rattled. "I never said any of that was funny, Mark. I'm questioning the responsibility that comes with turning trauma into entertainment." "Responsibility?" Wahlberg's voice was incredulous. "You want to talk about responsibility? How about the responsibility of actually doing something instead of just talking about it? How about putting your money where your mouth is instead of just running your mouth?" "What exactly are you suggesting I should do?" Colbert asked, his voice rising to match Wahlberg's intensity. "I'm suggesting that maybe before you criticize someone for the way they handle their success, you should take a look at how you handle yours," Wahlberg fired back. "When's the last time you were in Dorchester, Stephen? When's the last time you actually talked to kids who are living what you're so concerned about me exploiting?" "That's not the point," Colbert insisted, but Wahlberg cut him off. "That's exactly the point," Wahlberg said, moving closer to Colbert's desk. "You sit up here in your ivory tower, making jokes about politicians and celebrities, collecting your paycheck and going home to your nice house in your nice neighborhood. But you want to lecture me about responsibility." The audience was completely silent now, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself might shatter. Colbert's producers were frantically gesturing from the wings, but neither man was paying attention to anything except the battle of words happening between them. "You know what?" Mark Colbert said, his voice steady but cold. "You're right. I am privileged. I don't pretend otherwise. But at least I'm not pretending that making violent movies is some kind of public service." Wahlberg's eyes flashed with fury. "Public service? You think that's what this is about? You think I make these movies to feel good about myself?" "I think you make these movies because they make you a lot of money," Colbert replied bluntly. "And you've found a way to convince yourself that there's some higher purpose to it." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Wahlberg stared at Colbert for a long moment, his breathing heavy, his fists clenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with barely contained rage. "You want to know what higher purpose looks like, Stephen?" Wahlberg said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying more menace than any shout could have managed. "Higher purpose is getting a letter from a kid in Detroit who says, 'My movie,' made him realize he could be something other than what his environment told him he had to be. Higher purpose is funding scholarships that you've probably never even heard of, because they don't come with press conferences and photo opportunities." Colbert's expression faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "That's great, Mark, truly. But that doesn't change the fact that for every kid who gets inspired, there might be 10 more who think the answer to their problems is to act like your characters." "And whose fault is that?" Wahlberg demanded, stepping even closer to Colbert's desk. "The guy who makes the movie, or the society that's so broken that kids see violence as their only option? Where were you when those kids needed mentors, Stephen? Where were you when they needed programs, when they needed investment in their communities?" "I wasn't there," Colbert admitted, his voice tight, "but neither were you until you became famous enough to make it a tax write-off." The words hit Wahlberg like a physical slap. His face went from red to pale in an instant, and the dangerous quiet that followed made everyone in the studio hold their breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "A tax write-off," Wahlberg repeated slowly, as if tasting something bitter. "You think that's what this is about? You really think that's what drives me?" "I think," Colbert said, clearly realizing he'd crossed a line, but unable to back down now, "that you've built a brand around being the tough guy who made good, and everything else is just marketing." Wahlberg nodded slowly, a cold smile spreading across his face that was somehow more unsettling than his anger had been. "You know what, Stephen? You're absolutely right about one thing. I did build a brand, and part of that brand is knowing when I'm in a room with someone who doesn't respect me, doesn't understand me, and sure as hell doesn't deserve my time." He turned toward the audience, his voice projecting clearly across the studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, I came here tonight to talk about a movie that, yeah, has action in it, has conflict in it, but at its core is about people who care enough about something to fight for it. Instead, I got ambushed by someone who thinks he knows my story better than I do." Colbert tried to interject. "Mark, that's not what this was about." "Don't," Wahlberg said, holding up a hand without even looking at him. "Just don't. You had your chance to have a conversation. Instead, you chose to have an interrogation." He walked back toward his chair. But instead of sitting down, he grabbed his jacket from the back of it. "You want to know the real difference between us, Stephen? When I was a kid getting into fights, it wasn't because I wanted to. It was because sometimes fighting was the only way to protect something that mattered. Your fight tonight, this little performance, it's not protecting anything. It's just ego." The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the cameras. Colbert stood behind his desk, his face a mixture of anger and something that might have been regret. "Mark, we can continue this conversation like adults." Wahlberg turned back one final time, his jacket slung over his shoulder. "Adults, Stephen. Adults don't invite someone onto their show just to tear them down for entertainment. That's what bullies do. And I learned a long time ago not to waste time with bullies." He started walking toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silent studio. Colbert called after him, "So you're just going to walk away? That's your solution to conflict?" Wahlberg paused at the edge of the stage, turning back with that same cold smile. "No, Stephen. Walking away is my solution to wasting time with people who mistake cynicism for intelligence and cruelty for comedy." He disappeared into the wings, leaving Colbert standing alone at his desk. The audience, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in stunned silence. The cameras kept rolling for several more seconds, capturing Colbert's attempt to regain his composure. "Well," Colbert finally said, his voice shaky but trying to project his usual confidence, "that was certainly not how I expected this evening to go. But the damage was done. The interview that was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance had turned into something much more raw, much more real, and infinitely more uncomfortable than anyone had bargained for." And that's how one of Hollywood's biggest stars walked off one of late-night television's biggest stages, leaving behind a moment that no one in that studio would ever forget. What did you think of this incredible confrontation? Was Colbert right to press Wahlberg on these issues, or did he cross a line that shouldn't have been crossed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories from the world of entertainment that you won't see anywhere else.